Welcome to the Emotions Explained news series. This is a new feature that I'm kicking around. I think that we have all these news items each day. Many of them go on for months, if not years, and we kind of don't have some insight as to why they continue to be in the news. After all, you would think if an issue is a problem, at some point we figure out what's going on, move on, and just go on to other stuff. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Case in point, homelessness. This has been an issue for years, probably for decades at this point. But we don't seem to be having any real, progress with it. And I think part of that is to do with the fact that from a societal standpoint, we kind of really don't understand behavior. So I'm going to be the first maybe to tell you that homelessness is a behavior problem, but probably not in the way that you think. Let me explain. In order to understand homelessness as a behavior problem, we need to understand what drives homelessness and almost really what homelessness is. So what I mean by the second part is the fact that just because a person is living in a house doesn't necessarily mean that they're not homeless. Technically what it means is kind of like they're not contributing to their rent and they're kind of living there, because they don't have anywhere else to go. And it kind of means like a person who's couch surfing. So a person who's technically living in a home but is not able to afford one in their home may technically be considered homelessness. And the other aspect of it, there's this issue of kind of like homelessness and chronic homelessness. And what that means is that there are people who are, homeless for a short period of time, 3 months, maybe a year. But then there are those who are chronic homeless, and they've been homeless for, years, if not decades. And that's kind of the persona that we typically associate with someone who's homeless. Nonetheless, all these different types of people are considered homeless. And what do I mean by that? For example, let's say there's a couple that doesn't save enough for retirement. Retirement comes along and boom, now they can't work for themselves anymore, they become homeless. There's a person who has come up with some health condition and their medical bills bankrupt them. Even if they have health insurance, that person can become homeless. There's the person who loses their job. Maybe a factory closes down in their town and they only have a certain amount of money in savings, and at some point, 3-6 months down the road, they become homeless. So as you start to talk about it, you can understand that it's not just this, this veteran who's doing drugs, who doesn't want to live with anyone who's homeless. There are many different factors, including the fact that there are families, and oftentimes there are people who are fleeing situations like domestic violence who are also considered homeless. So let's at least consider that. Now, in all these other situations, you can kind of understand where it's definitely a behavior issue. For example, we're supposed to save for retirement. If we're not able to do that and find ourselves homeless in our 70s because we can't work to support ourselves and don't have money or savings to pay for a home, well, that kind of is a long-term behavior problem. And certainly when people are fleeing domestic violence, while they themselves don't necessarily have a behavior problem, it's the violence of the person who's driving them that is actually the behavior issue that's not being resolved in society. And we can talk about other things. For example, I know me personally, if I, became financially destitute and couldn't afford to live somewhere on my own, I have family and friends that I could ask. And that's kind of a key component here. People, they may say that they want to be homeless, but in reality, they're probably telling you two things. Number one, they don't have anywhere that they can live, even if it wasn't a choice. And second of all, even if they did have somewhere they could live, maybe there are some behavior problems that are driving their inability to get along with other people. After all, if you can't afford a single family house on your own, and there are plenty of people in that situation, so you have to share a residence with someone else, and you can't get along with those people, at some point that may result in your becoming homeless. So now, even if we put all these other issues aside, for example, like the domestic violence, the retirees, and so on, and we just talk about the chronically homeless people, those people who are probably living in the street, and those people who do probably have some serious mental health issues, right? Even then, we have to figure out, well, what can we do with these people? We just can't let them be. And we also need to consider, to some extent, where does this come from? It's not like these people are likely growing up in healthy households. More than likely, there was a really dysfunctional household, and a whole bunch of bad things had to happen to that person in order for them to end up on the street. Now, in line with that, we have to also look at the fact that we as a society do have some responsibility to these people, or at least I think so. Some people may call that socialistic, but even if you are just a religious person, I have to feel like it's very punitive and almost callous and cruel to not consider that someone might be suffering and we're not doing anything about it. Now, in line with that, we have to look at the fact that we had a budget surplus for year. I'm doing this now in the year 2020, and we've had one of the longest boom markets in our, in business expansions in our history. At the same time, at the end of this business expansion, a good 10, 12 years into it, we still had a major homelessness problem. Now, yes, some of it is driven by affordable housing issues, but nonetheless, if we're making so much money and we have such a surplus and we weren't able to fix it, what happens when things turn down, which is now what's going on with the pandemic? Well, things are probably going to get out of control next year in 2021. Also in line with that, we need to consider this whole concept of affordable housing. And I can tell you to some extent that there's no such thing as affordable housing. What do I mean by that? Well, if you don't have any money, you can't afford anything. So affordable housing means something that would cost for free, and there is no such thing. Well, there is something called subsidized housing. Because at some point, number one, you can't build housing below a certain level, right? If you build it and you don't meet a certain standard, it's substandard housing and it's dangerous. So housing costs a certain amount. Plus, that housing needs to be taken care of over time. So there are maintenance and upkeep costs. So again, that has to be taken care of. And finally, that house, if they're at an income level that is below the poverty level and not paying taxes for it, well, they're still using city services. So to some extent, those services need to be covered by other people, and in effect, the other taxpayers are subsidizing that housing either directly or indirectly. So that's a really important thing to understand. There is no such thing as affordable housing. And one other thing that I need to mention in that area, for every one person who's homeless and at a financial situation where they can't afford to take care of themselves, there are a dozen other people that are kind of right on that border. And this is a well-known statistical fact in government policies. The point here is that when we raise taxes to build affordable housing, in effect, what we're potentially doing is, because we're raising taxes, we're putting more people into a homelessness situation, which might explain the fact that even though we keep building affordable housing, we are not solving the problem. So there seems to be this constant influx of new people, and that's a problem. Because at some point, it's not going to scale. So if we keep building affordable housing, keep raising the tax base, keep raising the amount of people that are not contributing to society and more being subsidized by it, at some point, we're going to reach a breaking point where just not enough people are taking care of themselves. And that's kind of the ultimate behavior issue that I really want to talk about here, is the fact that we need to figure out a way that when people cannot sustain themselves from an economic standpoint, what can we do to help them? Here comes the solution that I'm talking about from a behavior standpoint. The solution, as I see it, is something I refer to as micro-integration. And what I mean by that is that, let's think about affordable housing, okay? So we have a bunch of people who are economically struggling, and we're going to put them all together. There is a really good chance that those people in general don't have great behavior, going on with them. In fact, that's probably a lot of what's driving their economic issues in the first place. They're having problems keeping work. They're having problems getting along with other people. They're having problems kind of sustaining themselves. These are all behavior issues. So if you take a bunch of people who are kind of struggling behaviorally and potentially struggling emotionally, as well as with mental health issues, and you put them all together in one setting, well, that might be good for the rest of us because we don't see the problem. But from a city standpoint, and certainly from like a law enforcement standpoint, you're not solving the problem. In effect, you're hiding it. So I'm going to suggest that the current approach to affordable housing is really just making us feel better because we don't see the people. They're not in the street and they're somewhere else, but potentially they're living in squalor and not a great situation, and potentially one that is violent and riddled with social strife. Okay, so in line with that, what is micro-integration housing? Micro-integration housing is this concept that you take one person who's not doing well, struggling, and you put them in a situation with a bunch of other people, especially families, people who are successful, people who are doing well in business, people who are having no issues socially, and you integrate them, right? You kind of take a group foster care, right? They take care of one adult and they help them get, number one, socially acclimated, because now they have to be accountable to this group. But they're also, more importantly, they have a lot of the stressors have been reduced. If you take a bunch of people who are homeless and you put them together in a situation, then they're going to kind of, impact each other, right? All these other people are struggling, and none of those people have the energy or the emotional bandwidth to take care of them. Now let's figure that you take that person and you put them with a whole bunch of families, maybe professionals and other people who are doing well. Well, at that point, they're now the person who is, maybe just the only person struggling, but you have a whole bunch of other people supporting them. In my mind, this is the way that communities worked in the past naturally, certainly when we were in the clan or the tribe size. And it's the concept that if you take too big a problem and just put it off in a separate area, you're likely not going to make any improvement on it. If you want to help an individual, you need to integrate them with society. You have to get enough people in a group, and it could be, let's say, a group of 100 people, but maybe only 10 or 20 of them are really active with this person, and 80 or 90 of them are just doing it on a really part-time, intermittent basis. But the point being, you get now a group that is working together to help this person, where they have the capacity to do that. More importantly, and this is the most important thing, you're taking the responsibility of solving a problem and giving it back to society. To some extent, if a person becomes homeless later on in their life, there's probably something that a society has ignored earlier on, which allowed this person to get into a behavioral state where they're unable to take care of themselves. So to some extent, this is kind of like later on remediation. Ultimately, the answer is we need to invest more in families, make sure that people are growing up who are emotionally balanced, and by the time that they're adults, they're happy, and most importantly, they're independent. They can take care of themselves, they're self-sustaining, and they're contributing to society rather than being a drain on it. And when they can't do it, we as a society need to figure out it's our problem and what can we do about it. Thank you for listening.